Well, I'm excited to introduce Gene Baur. He's been referred to by Time magazine as the conscience of the food movement. He's the president and co-founder of Farm Sanctuary. He's the author of Living the Farm Sanctuary Life. In fact, in today's New York Times, there's an article about Jon Stewart's wife. He formerly had The Daily Show, and his wife was inspired by Gene and Farm Sanctuary to start her own farm sanctuary, which they're doing what they love. They're going to start a farm sanctuary in New Jersey. So, and we are happy to, yesterday, Gene led their annual walk in New York City, Farm Sanctuary Walk, which was a wonderful turnout of people in support of helping reduce suffering and cruelty of animals in the planet. And he's a great guy, also a triathlete, and does a lot of stuff in Washington to help. In fact, I read you were partly part of getting veggie burgers in the Burger King. That's no easy task there. And a lot of other things that he's been involved in. So please welcome Gene Baur. Thanks for being here with us, Gene. Yeah, while you're turning that on, I'm gonna share a little verse of scripture this morning. It's from Job chapter 12, verses 7 to 8. Ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee. Or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee. Now that says to us that if we listen close enough and we look, we can learn from the animals, we can learn from the earth. And St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of animals and the environment, of which Pope Francis has his namesake, talks about brother sun and sister moon, and how we can, in unity, we say there's one presence and one power. The Bible says God is in all and through all, which means we can learn from the animals, from all of life, that there's an intelligence present there, a consciousness of which we can be a part of. And so that's why, we're talking about the unity of life today, Gene. That's why we wanted to have you come in today, because of your work with animals. If you could just share with us a little bit about what you do with the animals, Gene.
So Farm Sanctuary started in 1986, and we felt it was important to document what was happening. So I actually started visiting farms and stockyards and slaughterhouses, and we would find living animals thrown in trash cans, or living animals thrown on piles of dead animals. So we started rescuing them, and we now have farms in New York and California where the animals get to enjoy their lives. They're our friends, not our food. I've been a vegan since 1985, and the animals just get to enjoy their lives, and we also get to share in the joy that they experience. When they first come to the sanctuary, they're oftentimes very frightened of people because they've only known cruelty and pain at human hands. They've been kept in small cages where they can't move. They've had parts of their bodies cut off. It's routine for pigs' tails to be cut off, for example, with no painkillers. And so when a human being would approach them, historically, it would be not a pleasant experience. And so they were hurt physically and emotionally. And once they come to the sanctuary, they learn to trust people again. And then they begin to heal physically and emotionally, and then to enjoy life and to run around in the pastures, cows kicking up their heels. And they come to enjoy our company, and we have turkeys that follow you around like puppy dogs on the farm, and you'll sit down in the pasture and they'll sit on your lap. And we have sheep that love to be petted, so like you pet your dog, the sheep wants to be petted, and when you're ready to walk away, the sheep paws at you saying, keep petting me, So they're not that different than cats and dogs. And that's, the message is that these are living, feeling creatures. Yes. They are part of life. When we are kind to them, it's actually good for us. When we are cruel to them, it's bad for them and it's bad for us. Can you imagine working in a slaughterhouse? So it's really about reshaping our relationship with these other animals.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that work. You know, I became a vegetarian in 1987, and but I did it more for different reasons. I became a vegetarian because I thought it would help me spiritually, and because I learned it was better for me physically. But only, you know, in the last 6 months, I began to see a greater connection with the animals. You know, it's expanding my consciousness because, as you mentioned, a sheep or a turkey likes to be petted like a pet. You know, how many of you have a cat or a dog or have had a pet in the past? Okay. Well, anybody who loves their pet can see that they have feelings, don't they? They get sad, they get sometimes annoyed, right? Sometimes they're happy, they're joyful. And animals have feelings like us. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when I was 8 years old, I used to go to camp, horse camps during the summer for 1 month, 2 months. And one of these camps, they gave us a horse for the whole summer. And we would get to name the horse. Now imagine being a horse and getting a different name every summer. It's a little schizophrenic horse after a while, maybe, I don't know. So I named this horse Virginia after my home state. And we would take care of the horse. And the older kids in the morning, I was about 8. In the morning, the older kids would go out to the pastures with feed and attract the other horses and then bring them back to the barn. One morning, I joined them. And there was a mare in the pasture with a little baby, newly born filly, little girl horse. And my horse, Virginia, started to try to claim the little filly. And they got into a kicking match. And I got in the middle of it. And I got kicked in the mouth by Virginia. So I was okay. But after a couple days, I visited Virginia again. And I noticed as a 9 or 8-year-old, how affectionate Virginia was. She was more affectionate than normal, with a nose nudge, and I had the feeling she knows that she hurt me by accident. And she was sorry. I really felt that. And you might go, well, that's your interpretation. But people who are watching animals in the wild, they're seeing animals that have empathy. They're seeing animals that have sadness over the death of loved ones. They're seeing that they have emotions just like us.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you see that all the time.
Definitely, and they're made of bone and flesh and blood like we are physically. Emotionally, they have evolved in relationships with other animals.
Yeah.
And like human beings or cats and dogs, they want to enjoy positive, mutually beneficial relationships.
Yes.
And they have bonds and
Yes.
emotional connections. We have had animals that get to know each other and are inseparable. You know, one, for example, was a pig named Hope, and she was crippled. You know, we found her at a stockyard, just left for dead, brought her to the sanctuary, we took care of her.
Yeah.
And whenever we fed her, we had to make sure that other pigs were not going to get her food, because some pigs are a little bit voracious about eating.
You mentioned a pig in the story in the book that liked to eat her food, right?
Yeah, Raquel, yes, Raquel. And so when I would feed Hope, I would have to kind of make sure Raquel wasn't going after her food, and Raquel knew she wasn't supposed to do it. So I would feed Hope, and then I would have to shoo Raquel away. And sometimes when I would leave, Raquel would I would position myself where I could see her and she couldn't see me, and she would be there thinking, is that guy around, or, you know, can I get away with this?
You said her ears would perk up and her eyes would get bigger.
Exactly. So she knew she was doing something naughty and wondered if she'd get away. So, you know, they're not different than people in terms of emotions and ways they behave. But eventually we rescued another pig named Johnny, who was very young, and he and Hope really bonded. And so then he started protecting her and making sure that she got her food and I didn't have to watch anymore. And then Hope was older and she died. And then Johnny was depressed after that, and he died just a couple weeks later. And, you know, there's this emotional, intense connection they had.
Yeah.
And, you know, there was no, you know, we think he died of a broken heart, basically. So their emotions are so strong and so deep. And the more we pay attention, the more we recognize how these animals have feelings. And
Yeah.
scientists are now starting to recognize also that they have capacities, cognitive and emotional capacities, way beyond what we have given them credit for. And so we're in the midst of a shift in consciousness and awareness and a recognition that they're much more intelligent and more sensitive than we've ever really thought. And
Yeah.
you know, when you're mistreating somebody, like we have been mistreating farm animals, there's kind of an emotional desire not to pay attention because it makes that mistreatment so much more upsetting. So for a long time, I believe we've just kind of closed our eyes and said, I don't want to know. You know, when the issue of factory farming comes up oftentimes, people say, I don't want to know, it's too upsetting. It's because we have empathy. We are connected to others. When we see somebody else hurt, we sort of naturally feel something. So the main thing is, as we pay attention, we recognize that, you know, what we've been doing is something we should reevaluate. And we're in the midst of a movement now, and it's a good thing to see where people are recognizing how harmful factory farming is, and there's a shift away from that industry. So we're the beginning of it, but eating more plants and fewer animals is good for animals, it's good for us, it's good for the planet.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, what the book Living the Farm Sanctuary Life is about, is living in a way that is aligned with our own interests. So we're eating food that is good for us and nourishing, and we're also eating food that's aligned with our values. So instead of saying, I don't want to hear about the slaughterhouse, I don't want to hear about the cruelty, we can say, I know where my food comes from, and I'm happy about it, and I feel good about it. And it's a very empowering thing. There's many things in the world that are out of our control, but when it comes to what we eat, every day each of us has a lot of control over that. So it's one of these things that, you know, people feel better physically, you know, and emotionally, and it often starts with small steps, you know, like a meatless Monday, for example.
A meatless Monday.
Yeah, like we're one day a week, you know, trying to go meatless.
Yeah.
And eating plant foods instead. And so for spaghetti and meatballs, there's now these veggie meatballs you can use instead of meat meatballs. So it's pretty easy to do. Or you could just throw more veggies in the spaghetti sauce, and that's healthier than, you know, ground beef, for example.
Meatless Monday, that's pretty good. That's doable for anyone, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. So these are very practical, simple things that can be done. Because the idea of going, you know, from being a meat eater to becoming a vegan overnight can be scary.
Oh, sure.
You know, and change is scary.
Yeah.
So small steps often lead to more steps, which ultimately lead to big changes, very positive changes.
Yeah. You know, an ancient philosopher, I think it was Pythagoras, who said that man is the measure of all things. And I kind of grew up unconsciously feeling like we're humans, it's all about us, and the animals are just sort of there. You know, they're there. You go to the zoo, you enjoy looking at animals, you enjoy looking at them in nature. But they're kind of for us if we want to use them or do with them as we will. But I'm learning more, and it's opening my consciousness that animals exist just because they exist. You know, they exist for their own purposes. That God created all of the animals. In fact, they existed before we did.
Right.
And that we inherited emotions, genes, our nervous systems. They know now, if you look at the tiniest thing, a worm, a couple of centimeters long, it has the essential nervous system, like 360 neurons or something like that, whereas you and I have billions. And scientists are saying the animals have essentially the same kind of stuff, only in different patterns and organization. And for me, it's sort of opening up and going, wait a minute, these creatures exist because God wants them to exist. And that having dominion, as the Bible says, over the earth doesn't mean domination. It means good stewardship. It means respect. And I love the fact that Pope Francis is bringing this out in his recent encyclical, which he's called Praised Be, in honor of his namesake, St. Francis of Assisi, one of my favorite saints. Yogananda, the Indian sage, loved St. Francis. He said he was an enlightened being. And so the Pope named his encyclical, Be Praised. Well, this phrase is in there. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures. That was St. Francis's statement. Through all your creatures. And certainly putting a pig, I mean, there's pigs, it's terrible. Pigs in crates, they can't see left or right their whole life.
Yeah, 2-foot wide crates, they can't move, they can't turn around. That's how they live their whole lives, yes.
And didn't you end something like that in Florida?
Yes, we worked on a voter initiative in the state of Florida where we were able to get a measure on the ballot for a popular vote. And when people had the opportunity to vote on it, they voted to ban these small crates in Florida. We've also been able to pass 2 other similar measures, one in Arizona and one in California. And every time we've been able to get a measure on the ballot for a popular vote, we've been able to succeed because people don't like cruelty. The difficulty, of course, is agribusiness is very powerful in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals. And when we've introduced legislation in the past, it tends to get referred to an agriculture committee, which is made up of lawmakers very friendly to agribusiness, and those bills generally die without even a hearing. So going to the people, we've been successful. And there's an effort right now, in fact, in Massachusetts, to get signatures to put a measure on the ballot to ban this kind of inhumane confinement. So it's...
I love that.
Yeah, so we're seeing a little bit of progress there. And the legislation is frankly quite minimal. It only gives animals space to turn around and stretch their limbs. And it's amazing that we have to take that to the voters for a vote. But the industry has put animals in cages where they can't turn around, they can't stretch their limbs. And they live this way for months, or in some cases for years. In the case of egg-laying hens, for example, they're in these small wire cages where they can't stretch their wings. They're constantly scraping against these wire bars. Their feathers wear off. They have bruises and abrasions on their bodies, and they live about a year that way, or 2 years sometimes. And so, you know, when people see this, they don't think it's okay. And so the good news, though, is there's social media now. People are sharing pictures and images. Consumers are learning. And so we are in the midst of a shift. And it's about education. It's about people making more thoughtful, mindful, informed choices about our food. And if we can live well without causing unnecessary harm, why wouldn't we?
I was driving home from Virginia a couple of weeks ago. That's a good. I was driving home from Virginia a couple of weeks ago with the threat of the hurricane. And it was raining. And I was putting gas in my car, and I looked up. There was this big tractor trailer full of little cages with several chickens on top of each other, you know, like, I don't know, just really confined. And it's just raining on them. You know, no cover, just raining on them. And I understand these chickens end up sick, and you can smell ammonia in the factories, and and that's what we end up with. But what you were saying reminds me of there's a lot of power opposing these things, and yet, of course, there's been a lot of power opposing a lot of things over time. But the more people begin to support that and wake up, which you're doing and have been doing for several decades, things change. And here's a wonderful quote by a change agent, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One day, the absurdity of the almost universal human belief in the slavery of other animals will be palpable. We shall then have discovered our souls and become worthier of sharing this planet with them.
It's beautiful.
Isn't that a great quote?
It's beautiful,
Enlightened people who are expanding their consciousness. And that's what's happening. It's really just an awakening. People like you are just helping us awaken, and the scientists like Jane Goodall, who has worked closely. She says this. She's a primatologist and UN messenger for peace. Farm animals are far more aware and intelligent than we ever imagined. And despite having been bred as domestic slaves, they are individual beings in their own right. As such, they deserve our respect and our help. Who will plead for them if we are silent?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, each of us plays a role. Every day, you know, we grow up in a certain way, and there's certain patterns of behavior we have, you know, and it's just a matter of being conscious of those, looking at those, and then ultimately asking ourselves what makes the most sense, what is the healthiest, what is the most humane, compassionate way to live. And to me, being vegan is an aspiration to live as kindly as possible. Really as simple as that. And it's not an end point. no human being is perfect, but we all do the best we can, and we can always try to continue improving and striving to live as kindly as possible. And doing this is not only good for us, it's good for other animals. It really, and being kind to other animals enriches us. So it's a win-win.
Well, Gene, I did the Revs Fit and Trim workshop in the spring, because I lost 39 pounds at one point, and it's maintained that. And I basically, the healthiest diet, and I've been studying nutrition for over 25 years, they say vegan is perhaps, or just with a little meat each week, is the healthiest way to live.
Yeah.
And actually you lose weight, because there's a lot of fat in meat.
Yes.
There's a chemical process or something that happens that creates fat from that consumption. So some of the little things we can do, you mentioned a meatless Monday.
Yeah.
We could do cage-free eggs if you like eggs, right?
Yep, those are definitely better than the battery cage eggs.
Yeah.
And I think eating less meat, and smaller portions of meat.
Smaller portions.
And beans are great, in the blue zones.
Sure.
One of the things Dan Buettner talks about in terms of longevity is a cup of beans a day.
Absolutely.
Is one of the examples of how you live. And that's a great...
Soak them well, though. Soak them well. Yes.
But whole foods, fruits and vegetables are, that's sort of long time advice we've always heard, and less processed food, So just little things, having an apple.
Common sense, right?
Yes, common sense.
But uncommon practice.
Uncommon practice, right? We get into bad patterns and habits, and so it's addressing those and being conscious and then making mindful choices. And a lot of the choices are made actually at the store when you're shopping. Am I going to get that cookie or candy bar, or am I going to get that apple or orange? So that is where the big decision happens, because if you have it in your house, you're likely to eat it. And if you put something healthy there, you're going to eat it. If you put something not healthy, it's tough to...
Well, you can get a couple apples, a couple oranges, and maybe a little snack or something,
A little.
And just work your way, right?
That's true. It can be incremental, or a handful of nuts.
Or a handful of nuts. Yes.
In the book, Living the Farm Sanctuary Life, we have 100 amazing plant-based recipes as well. So,
wonderful.
So giving up meat is not about giving up taste or satisfying food, or feeling satiated and feeling nourished. So that's part of it too. And as you mentioned, I've done triathlons. I did an Ironman triathlon a couple years ago. I do marathons, and there's other athletes, elite athletes, people like Carl Lewis, who did his best times on a plant-based vegan diet.
No kidding, Carl Lewis.
Carl Lewis, the Olympic gold medalist. So this is a lifestyle that not only can you survive, but you can thrive.
Yes.
And chronic illnesses, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, can be addressed. And we could save, it's been estimated, 70% on healthcare costs by shifting to a whole foods plant-based diet.
Yeah.
So, and there's films about this and information about it that I'll be talking a lot more about later on.
Okay, and we can take small steps.
Yes.
Little steps, not just jump right off the deep end.
Exactly. Right,
but take small steps in whatever way that help us and help the planet and help the animals and help us expand our consciousness. Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, the founders of Unity, were vegetarians.
Oh, wow.
They actually had a vegetarian cafe at Unity Village. Now, I know a lot of Unity ministers and a lot of Unity people, you don't hear about that very much, but I was reading an article by them recently where Charles Fillmore was very much into that. He said that you take in the consciousness of the animal, and that when an animal is going to be slaughtered, they sense it. They sense it, and the fear and the anger and all of that goes through the body. And when you eat, you take it in, he said. And that, he said, when we eat, we're taking in the life idea. That it's not the material, it's the life idea. And so when you eat plants and vegetables and fruits, you're taking in life. But when you eat something that's dead, you're taking in dead cells. And it's not really enlivening. In fact, it takes in the consciousness of the animal.
Yes, stress hormones, violence, it's a violent world, the animal agriculture.
And I'm so impressed with Charles Fillmore and Myrtle, because even back then in the early 1900s when this was written, he was acknowledging the horrible conditions in which animals were being raised. And so, you know, it's such an honor to have you with us today, Gene, a man who is a mover and a shaker in a time where people weren't even aware of these things. And it's planting those little seeds, which you did with selling veggie dogs at the Grateful Dead concerts in the parking lot. And 50 years, or their 50th anniversary, they said, look, in the big stadium, we want to sell veggie dogs in the big
Soldier Field. That's
Soldier
right.
Field.
In Chicago, yeah.
You know, because they believe in that. And so I want to conclude our message today, Gene, with a quote from the ancient sage of Jainism. His name is Lord Mahavira. He said this in 527 BC. It sounds like St. Francis, sort of. One who neglects or disregards the existence of earth, water, fire, air, vegetable, and all other living beings disregards his own existence, which is entwined with them. So be a whisper or be a scream. Just be a voice for the voiceless being. A loud voice cannot compete with a clear voice, even if it's a whisper. Small things can make a difference. Even your whisper makes a difference. God bless you, and thank you so much.
Thank you.